Hello, I'm here to give a guest presentation for LLB 140, Human Rights Law. Carmel's asked me to record a short video for the students for this unit because I work in the law school and she knows, because we're colleagues, that I have a personal experience that is a real-life example of human rights issues. So, I'm not a lawyer at all, but this is a personal story and I think it will really help you to understand why human rights law is so important. So, who am I? I'm Tamara, and I'm a learning designer in the School of Law. Someone else that's an important part of this story is my ex-wife Bridget. The story is about the two of us and a situation we were in. Some of the stuff that I'm going to be discussing today includes terms like gender identity, biological sex, people who are transgender, people who are queer. If any of that terminology is confusing for you or just outside of your experience, and it was definitely outside of my experience a little over 5 years ago, there's going to be some links in the extra material provided, and it's really important to educate yourself because people who are already disempowered, there's a lot of burden a lot of the time on them to educate the mainstream. So I'm going to be talking about some human rights issues around transgendered people. So that's what we're looking at. If any of this material is confronting, you can have a chat to Carmel, you can read the extra links and you can learn a bit more about that. But this is a fairly big area of human rights issues in Australia and around the world, actually. So some of you may have heard of the highest ranking transgender officer in the Australian military, and she's been on Q&A, she's been in the Women's Weekly, and she's very famous basically because of her status as a transgender woman, Kate McGregor. She's a personal friend of the Prime Minister, she's a high-ranking army officer, and she's a cricket commentator. And the big thing about her story was that she transitioned at work while she was still serving in the army, and she had the full support of her chain of command, that's your boss, and that was really important to her acceptance of herself as a trans person and her success and her being able to not go down the path that a lot of trans folk do, is to suicide. A lot of people find that just too hard to deal with. I think it's important to realise, though, that there are some things that helped Kate along the way, and there are some people before her, and one of the people before her, or one of the groups of people before her, were Bridget and I. I suppose the thing is to put you in my place. So in about 2009, I thought Australia was a pretty fair place, and my family looked like this, and I was, and still sometimes can appear to be, I'm white, I looked heterosexual, I seemed middle class, we were employed and had a nice house and educated, and that means in Australian society that I'm empowered. So I thought, well, Australia's a pretty fair place. I don't know what some people complain about. I don't know why we need all this human rights stuff. I just don't understand. And I think I didn't understand because I never experienced that. People violating my human rights. I never experienced people treating me differently because of what they perceived me to be. I come from a working class background. I had worked very hard and I had been in the army myself. So I had worked hard to get educated, worked hard in a physical job to make my way in the world, and I thought everyone was able to do that. And then I had an experience, and I realised that your power is related to a lot of things about what people perceive about you. So what was the thing that happened? The thing that happened is that my partner came out as trans. So she said, I've been dealing with this issue for ever since I can remember. I didn't know what to do about it, but she sought treatment, so she saw a psychologist, and she decided that she needed to transition, which is what they call going from male to female or female to male. So she was male and was male when we were married and had our children, but then transitioned to female. And part of doing that is she came out when we were living in Wagga, which, if you haven't been there, is central New South Wales, 6 hours from Sydney, 6 hours from Melbourne. It really is the middle of nowhere. That's the main street. Okay, but we weren't just living in Wagga, the town. We were living on the army barracks, because my partner was at the home of the soldier, where they do all the recruit training for non-commissioned soldiers, and she was an officer there, and not just an officer in the army. There's a photo of her before on a deployment in East Timor. She wasn't just an officer in the army, she was an infantry officer. So she had a few hurdles to deal with. The army's reaction, the long and the short of it, was that they tried to fire her. There was a long, complicated process involved in that, and lots of medical reviews and all that sort of stuff, but really they just said, actually, we don't want to deal with that. And it's not just about losing a job. Losing a job matters, but 12 years of service in the military, moving our family around, going on operational deployments, risking her life. After 12 years, they gave her 4 weeks' notice. It was the loss of income. We were threatened with the loss of income, and she was the sole income for our family, so I had a 6-month-old baby. I wasn't working at the time. Our housing was owned, so they owned the house we lived in. You get subsidised accommodation with Defence, and you live in their housing. So our income, our house we lived in, my partner Bridget's medical and dental. So part of your conditions of service are all your medical and dental treatment. And when you're facing a major medical issue like changing gender, that matters. And most importantly, our community. We had invested 12 years of our life in this community, and the army, by trying to fire her, was threatening to cut us off from that. The only supports we had after moving around the country for years. So all of that would have been gone because she was trans and because she was going to go ahead with treatment. Now, some people might say, oh, well, how can you have a trans person in the military? I would say that I think the tricky thing about that is to realise how ungendered the work actually is. It is hard physical and mental work, absolutely, but I did it and my partner did it. So you need tough, capable people. It doesn't actually matter what their gender is or what their biological sex is, because you don't do any of the job with your genitals, pretty much. At the time, there was a ban on women in combat corps. That's since been lifted anyway. But that was a societal issue. That was our policy. It wasn't to do with capability. The other thing I suppose is important to think about with this is that someone who has been through Duntroon, which is the Royal Military College in Canberra, and I'm a graduate of RMC, and so was Bridget, and then she had been to the infantry officer basic course and intermediate courses, and all sorts of weapons training and deployments overseas and all sorts of extra training. She had millions of dollars worth of training invested in her as a soldier. So as a resource, she was worth, I think it was supposed to be worth $10 million worth of training and development. You cannot go put an ad in the paper or on Seek and get yourself a senior captain in the military. They have to develop their resources from the ground up. And so one of the reasons that medical is a part of conditions of service is that they invest in their people, and they invest in keeping them fit and healthy and capable and well, because you can't just replace them. The thing that was astounding to us is that Bridget's job at the time was non-gender specific, so it could be a male or female posted into that job. She was the second in command of the Army Adventurous Training Wing. So this is a specific unit at Kapuka. So she was the second in charge of that unit, and women had done that job. So it was quite clear that it didn't matter to her job whether she was male or female. What did matter is that she was going to be happier, more emotionally and mentally stable, still as physically capable, and she still is. It takes longer to recover. Without testosterone, it takes you a little bit longer to recover from extensive physical activity, but I did all of my officer training without that level of testosterone that men had, and I survived. So really, her physical capability was not affected, but the military just couldn't cope with it, and so they just tried to get rid of her. They said that's too hard, and they had been getting rid of trans people for more than 10 years. There had been a policy in place saying if you told anyone that you were trans, you would be immediately considered unfit for service. That policy had been in place for more than 10 years. Right, so when that advice came through that they were going to discharge her, she received a termination notice. We sought legal advice, and believe it or not, it wasn't a dice about always sue, beg now, or any of that. But a lot of it was over the phone, because there's not a lot of legal advice in Walker that deals with queer or transgender issues, and there's not a lot of legal advice that deals with a Commonwealth industrial relations law either. So we were calling Sydney, basically, because we were in New South Wales. The thing that we discovered from this legal advice is that the Department of Defence, that's a defence symbol, and the Army, being a part of the Department of Defence, is a Commonwealth employer. Okay, so New South Wales, as a state, has some really good anti-discrimination legislation, and that legislation specifies that it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of a whole range of things, but one of the things is gender identity. But because the Department of Defence is a Commonwealth employer, we were told that legislation wouldn't apply. And we moved states in between different things. Like this was over a course of a couple of years. The state laws in Queensland and New South Wales are quite good. The federal laws were not. Commonwealth law is still not great in this area. So we were advised that the best thing we could do was to lodge a complaint with the Australian Human Rights Commission until after she was discharged, so until after we'd lost the money, the housing, the everything. There was no recourse through industrial relations law. You can't make a case for unfair dismissal if you haven't actually been dismissed yet. So we lodged a complaint with the Australian Human Rights Commission against the Commonwealth Department of Defence. By the time that complaint made it to conciliation, and this is more than 6 months later, there were several cases of direct discrimination or harassment by a number of individuals. There was a list of people, what they'd said and done, that was not cool. There was indirect discrimination by the application of extant policy. So the policies in defence were discriminatory, and there were people who were saying, well, we're just following the policy, it's not our fault. So that's indirect or systemic discrimination that the organisation is responsible for. It's threatened with unfair dismissal, and there's of course a ridiculous amount of stress that goes with that. Bridget was denied a promotion and a pay rise. So she was a 6-year captain, so normally in your 6th year you're up for promotion to major. And Bridget's report, the last report before she came out to her chain of command, said that she was working well and she was ready for promotion now. So she was ready to go. As soon as she came out, she was deemed unsuitable for promotion. So that's I think it was about a $40,000 a year pay rise, different housing, different rank and job opportunities, everything that only changed when she told people that she was transgender. Multiple privacy breaches. Within defence, people shared information about her medical status, talked about her, held conferences about her. It was just ridiculous. There was no privacy anymore, and it got to the point where I, as her wife, could ring up the Defence Minister or even the Prime Minister's office and say my name, and they would know about the case and know who to put me through to. So I would say, this is Tamara, and I want to speak to someone about this. I need to talk to someone now. And they would say, right, we'll put you through to the Minister's advisor, because everyone was talking about stuff. And I didn't need to go through the normal channels anymore, which was... it wasn't actually good. It means everyone knew everything, or thought they knew everything about what was happening in our life. And the last thing, mental health injury due to stress and discrimination. So I didn't do so well out of this process myself. Bridget did more poorly. She really suffered from that direct discrimination and complete invalidation of who she was. It's hard enough for a trans person to go through transition, but by doing that, she put her job and her family and her entire life on the line, and yeah, there was some mental health issues for her resulting from that. So, there was no specific law that to cover. We could try and get each of those little points through under different laws. There's no specific law that covered all of them, so we went with the Australian Human Rights Commission. Now what I'm just going to do is just end the slideshow for a second and show you, right, if you'd like to look it up, you can see up here, humanrights.gov.au, and there's summaries of the legislation, and this shows you the federal legislation, and then they also have another law legislation which shows you the different states' legislation. So the thing that's really interesting, New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act, as I was saying earlier, grounds for unlawful discrimination include race, sex, marital status, disability, homosexuality, age, transgender specifically, and carer's responsibility. Okay, so you can make a complaint in writing, and investigation and conciliation can be attempted. Okay, so we could say, if it was under the New South Wales state law, we're being treated badly because she's transgender, do something about it. But because the Commonwealth Department is a Commonwealth body, they claimed that they didn't come under that law. Same with Queensland, just because we're in Queensland. Something that's really good for you to realise is Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act of 1991. Unlawful discrimination in Queensland includes sex, relationship status, pregnancy, parental status, breastfeeding, that's for goods and services, race, age, physical impairment, religion, political belief, trade union activity, lawful sexual activity, gender identity, that's the one that applies in this situation, gender identity, sexuality, family responsibility, or association with a person who has any of these attributes. So that also, if I was discriminated against because I was married to Bridget, because I was associated with someone who has a different gender identity. Okay, so the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Commission and the Anti-Discrimination Act is quite good. Once again, federally, not so much. Federally, our legal advice was that we could go for Disability Discrimination Act because being transgender, or if we're going with the medical terminology, being a diagnosed transsexual via the DSM-4, so Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 4, which was the psychiatric diagnosis at the time, because this started in 2009, we could say disability, but then basically would have to stand up in federal court and say, I am disabled, my trans status makes me disabled, and the military is treating me badly. One, that's total invalidation of someone who is not in any way disabled, and there is a whole problem with the medicalisation of trans people and saying that they are disordered or sick in some way. And the other part of that is that the military, the Department of Defence, has exemptions to the Disability Discrimination Act. It's why they can discharge people, like me, who are not physically capable anymore. Because you have to be physically fit to do your job, they can say, we're allowed to discharge you. So I was an army officer, I hurt my back 10 years ago, and I was discharged because I wasn't physically able to carry 50 kilos on my back anymore. And they have legal exemptions to that act. The other option was the Sex Discrimination Act. And I'll just show you here. Sex Discrimination Act covers equality between men and women, discrimination or eliminating discrimination on the basis of sex, marital status, pregnancy, family responsibilities. Okay, it didn't really cover gender or gender identity. Okay, now in 2013 there was some updating, or there was consultation about updating the Sex Discrimination Act, and to be honest I haven't read it, but it might be worth you guys having a look at it. There was certainly the plan, the amendment that went through in so this is the Sex Discrimination Amendment, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Status Act 2013. So that went through and amended the Sex Discrimination Act to include sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status. Okay? And this basically would have given us legal grounds to fight the government. But at the time, there was nothing. So we were forced to just make a human rights complaint and say this is a human rights issue, because there wasn't anything specific, nothing clear in our laws that covered that. The good thing, though, is that the Human Rights Commission Act establishes the Human Rights Commission, and it gives functions in relation to the following international instruments. And the one that matters, the poor treatment, to basically the Human Rights Commission was our only way to try and get something to happen to make things be different. So I'll go back to my PowerPoint slides now. So next slide. Oh, sorry, I'll click through these. Alright, so all of those issues were under the one human rights complaint. And then we went to a conciliation meeting. So when you go to a conciliation meeting, it's actually not like a court of law. Here we go. Back again on the human rights website. Conciliation is an informal, flexible approach to resolving complaints. And you can letters, telephone negotiation, there was a bit of that, or a face-to-face conciliation conference. It's not a public hearing, a court of law, or a tribunal. Parties do not have to prove or disprove the complaint. Instead, conciliation allows people to state their point of view, discuss the issues in dispute and settle the matter of their own terms. Okay, so that's what's supposed to happen. And our lawyers basically, we did have a lawyer, because we were completely overwhelmed by this process. Our lawyer had been to other conciliation meetings and said, look, it comes down to everyone just accepts what happened has happened. It's no one's fault. No one's going to accept liability, but you're going to find some way in the middle to settle it. And it will usually be by financial compensation for stress and harm and hurt and discrimination caused. Okay, and we'll have to work out what that might look like. The tricky thing for us was that the conciliation meeting completely failed. And we had been waiting for a year just to get to that first stage of the conciliation meeting, and there were 3 representatives from the Department of Defence, 2 civilian and 1 in uniform with a lot of brass on it, which is an intimidation in itself for people who are uniform members, sat across the table from us and said there are no laws in Australia that say that what we did was illegal, so we're not going to reconciliate with you. We're not going to give you anything. We're not going to offer you anything because we did nothing illegal. And if you try to take this to court, you won't win. And I can tell you that was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. The meeting went on for half the day. They separated the parties and were back and forth with the facilitator trying to get something to happen, trying to get Defence to at least meet us in the middle with something. But essentially they had all the power and all the money, and they said, we know that you can't do anything via any other channel, so we're not willing to offer you anything. Okay, so for me, I thought that Australia, as I said, was a fairly equal place, but then when I saw that people were treated differently, I thought, it's okay, we are educated, we are strong, we are able to speak for ourselves, we will be okay. It's actually unfortunate to know that there's not always justice even for people who fight for it. Often power and money comes into it. So conciliation had failed. Now what? With the system as it stands, and you'll be learning this from Carmel, and you'll probably know it a lot better than me, this is my layperson's understanding, is what happens next is reports can be tabled to Parliament. Okay. So, if a matter is not conciliated successfully and the Human Rights Commission finds that there has been some breach, they write a report and it gets tabled in Parliament. So I'll just show you one more thing. Obviously I'm showing a lot of things on this website. It's worth you having a look if you're interested. So this is in legal work projects, the human rights reports. These are the reports to the Minister. So if conciliation is unsuccessful or inappropriate and the Commission finds that there has been a breach of human rights or workplace discrimination has occurred, the Commission can prepare a report including the recommendations for action for the Attorney-General, and the report must be tabled in Parliament. Okay, and there's a list, and it goes on and on and on. These are of cases where people have kept pushing because they want something to happen, and they've pushed the Human Rights Commission to do something about it. Okay. So, a report can be tabled. For some of the issues, so for example, while we were still married, we're not married anymore, I think I said that, while we were still married, if Bridget wanted legal recognition of her gender as female, we would have to be divorced. So there are some of those issues that an individual can make a complaint against Australia, against the state of Australia, via the Human Rights Committee. The UN Human Rights Committee basically monitors whether the different states are complying with the ICCPR. So the other thing I'll show you on here, right. These are the different human rights bodies. There is the Human Rights Council, there's all these other things. These are different the charter-based bodies, treaty-based bodies. And a lot of this is above my understanding. I just know where our case would have gone. Would have gone to the Human Rights Committee, okay? The Human Rights Committee monitors whether countries are sticking to the ICCPR. The thing about that is that countries self-report. So Australia, for example, is not going to say, oh, by the way, we're breaching people's human rights. Countries self-report, and this committee doesn't have the resources to investigate whether countries are actually doing the right thing. So how much publicity different issues get in different countries really does influence whether they're actually brought up at this level, because the formal process doesn't have enough power and resources to go around and check on everybody. Now, if you want to, you can make an individual communication or individual complaint, state-to-state complaints, and there's inquiries. So there is this whole process, and you need support of people who understand that, and who understand the process and are willing to go with you to the United Nations. We did have people at ANU who were interested in that on the marriage issue, because it could have been a key to marriage equality in Australia. So they were interested in doing that pro bono legal representation. In the end, our relationship didn't survive the 5 years of stress, so it was a moot point. But as it still stands in Australia, the federal government amended the Sex Discrimination Act to say that it is not illegal, so it is not unlawful to discriminate against a trans person if they're married. So it's not illegal for the births, deaths and marriages people to refuse to give a current birth certificate, even if someone has met all the requirements. And the requirements in Australia are actually pretty strict. You have to have 2 letters from doctors, and you have to have had the surgery. You have to be checked out as your gender that you identify as. So you have to have surgery that sterilises. Like there's lots of issues around this stuff. Anyway, if you meet those requirements, if you are still married, you cannot have your legal documentation, which means you can't travel. It means a lot of things, actually. It means you can't be legally recognised as a gender that you present as in the world. Okay, so that's a big issue in Australia. but someone has to be willing to take it all the way to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and that's a lot of time and a lot of effort. So I suppose my question to you, if you were in that position, was what do you think you would do? And for us, you need to remember that there was small children and family, and just as the two adults, we had been through this massive change. We had been married for nearly 10 years, and then one of the people changed gender. It's huge. It's a huge thing. So I will tell you that we gave up, basically. We said we can't do this anymore. We can't keep fighting this. We found it very difficult to get any pro bono legal support, because essentially we earn too much for legal aid. It's a very difficult area of law, and it's slightly better now. There are some slightly better protections under the federal laws, but still it's a very difficult area of law to take any action on in Australia. And it's just something that people see as a bit too hard. And so Bridget got the policy change in the Department of Defence. So last time we knew, there was at least 10 more trans people that had come out and gone through transition and been supported at work and done all of this stuff. And they weren't threatened with losing their jobs. They weren't stood over. They weren't treated really badly by people. But that wasn't the case. There's always someone who has to blaze a trail, as they say. So I think the thing that's important to remember out of all of this is that this human rights law really does matter, and it may sound very esoteric and very theoretical to you, but these things cover the same basic rights we all have, and until someone breaches those rights, you don't really know how gutting it is to be a citizen, to be a capable, intelligent, employed citizen, good parent, good person, all of those things, and to be completely devalued and dehumanized by both your employer and your government. So, yeah, hopefully this little video has helped give you an example of a real-life human rights issue. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to Carmel and she'll get in touch with me. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'm just not giving you all my email address at work. And just a little bit of self-promotion. I have written a book about this and it'll be out later this year. It's called Matt, Bridget and Me. But I'm not expecting you all to buy the book. What I do want you to do is engage with why human rights law matters, and think about what you would do and whether you would be able to fight all the way to the United Nations because your government doesn't respect you, doesn't think that you have the same rights as every other person in their country.